Welcome everyone. I welcome you all to this popular lecture as part of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav as IMSC celebrates the 75 years of Indian independence. Today's talk will be given by two of my colleagues, Professor Pinaki Chaudhary and Professor R. Shankar, on the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021. I am also delighted to tell you that we have Professor Bhaskaran to moderate this session. Without further ado, I would request Professor Bhaskaran to say a few words about this Nobel Prize and also introduce the speakers. Over to you, Professor Bhaskaran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arijit. I'm very happy to be with you virtually today evening and it's raining outside. So this talk is going to be about the celebration of this year's Nobel Prize in Physics. So I'm very happy to introduce two of my colleagues, and R. Shankar. Pinaki, after completing his undergraduate study at Presidency College, joined Indian Institute of Science, did a master's and PhD in 2006. And then he joined us IMSc faculty in 2014. So Pinaki's specialty is soft matter and non-equilibrium phenomena. So he has studied disordered systems, supercooled liquid, gases, jamming, gels, and so on. So he's a right person to talk about the complexity issues that Parisi studied. So I'm very happy to introduce Pinaki. The second speaker is Professor R. Shankar, my longtime collaborator. So Shankar, after a PhD, after his undergraduate study at IIT Delhi, he completed a PhD at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in 1979, and he became an IMSc faculty in 1991. His specialty is as broad as Giorgio Parisi, about whom he will be talking about. So Shankar started as a high-energy physicist, string theorist, and got into strongly correlated electron systems, geometry and topology of quantum many-body system. Now he's studying laser. It's amazing. So I'm very happy to introduce both the speakers. So I believe each speakers will have about 35 minutes each. So we will have a common question answer session at the end of the session. Is that correct, Arijit?
Thank you, Professor Bhaskaran. I should also announce that this talk is also streamed live on YouTube. So participants are requested to, those who are on Zoom can type their questions on chat. Professor Bhaskaran can take it and also may allow you to unmute and ask further clarificatory questions. Those who are on YouTube can also type their questions on the chat window and we can pass it on to the speakers at the end of the talk. With that, Professor Bhaskaran, thank you.
Okay. So my general request is during the talk, if a question can be avoided, if you can wait till the two talks are over, it would be wonderful. Unless there is a pressing question which will help everybody. So with that, it's a pleasure to welcome Pinaki Chaudhary. So over to you, Pinaki.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Bhaskaran. Thanks to Arijit, Rahul, and other organizers for this meeting and also asking me to talk about the work of the Nobel laureates in this context. So I'll just start sharing my screen. Is it visible? The share
yeah,
screen?
very beautiful. Yeah, very
okay.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So what Shankar and I discussed was that I will first introduce the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021, and then I will specifically talk about the work of Giorgio Parisi. So as most of you know, the Nobel Prize in Physics in the year 2021 has been awarded to three persons, Sukuro Manabe, Klaus Hasselmann, and Giorgio Parisi. Sukuro Manabe and Hasselmann share half of the prize, and Giorgio Parisi share the other half of the prize. Yeah. So the prize is awarded for their groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of complex systems. So this is the broad citation that covers the work of all the three laureates. So half of the prize is awarded to Sukuro Manabe and Klaus Hasselmann for the physical modeling of Earth's climate, quantifying variability, and reliably predicting global warming. And this will be discussed by my colleague The other half is shared by Professor Giorgio Parisi, and his has been recognized for the discovery of the interplay of disorder and fluctuations in physical systems from atomic to planetary scales. So again, going back to the citation, Nobel Prize citation, so let me just read part of it to understand why this recognition. So basically, the Nobel Prize in Physics 2021 celebrates the physics of complex systems. So what are complex systems? Complex systems are systems which consist of many different interacting parts. And what the citation says is that these systems have been studied by physicists for a couple of centuries and can be difficult to describe mathematically. They have an enormous number of components or be governed by chance. They could be chaotic, like weather, where small deviations in initial values result in huge differences at a later stage. This year's laureates have all contributed to us gaining greater knowledge of such systems and their long-term development. So this is the broad umbrella or that recognizes or celebrates the work of these laureates in the context of the even broader class of complex systems that many of us are working in. So what is a complex system? I mean, that the citation itself already mentioned. So I'll just quickly give you some examples and give you a broad framework. So I'm just using Wikipedia. A complex system is a system composed of many components which interact with each other. So examples of complex systems are Earth's global climate, organisms, human brain, infrastructure such as power grid, transportation or communication systems, social and economic organization like cities, an ecosystem, a living cell, and ultimately the entire universe. So basically, any realistic world that we are confronted with would be an ideal example of a complex system because of this multitude of components which are interacting with each other with various forms. So the Wikipedia thing continues. The complex systems are systems whose behavior is intrinsically difficult to model due to the dependencies, competitions, relationships, or other types of interactions between their parts or between given system and its environment. So this is the basic thing, that it's very difficult to model because there are these very complicated interactions and relationships which sometimes you can't even figure out and you have to just guess. And then the systems that are complex, these have distinct properties that arise from these relationships, such as nonlinearity, emergence, spontaneous order, adaptation, feedback loops, among others. And because such systems appear in wide variety of fields, the commonalities among them have become a topic of their independent area of research. So the important thing, again, let me highlight is that there is very complicated interactions between these different parts. It's a system which has components interacting with many complicated interactions and so on. But you have very rich behavior that comes out of it. And because it involves different kinds of disciplines, etc., so the physics, the science of complex systems is a very interdisciplinary field. Let's say over the last 4 decades or so has involved a huge number of researchers across many different fields, and that has contributed to the enormous progress that we have made in the last 4 decades or so. And the recognition of the work of Manabe, Hasselmann, and Parisi is a celebration of their contribution in our greater understanding of such complex systems, and some particular examples of that. So I'll focus on the Nobel Prize in Physics given to Professor Giorgio Parisi, who is a professor at the University of Rome. So his work, he is recognized for the discovery of interplay of disorder and fluctuations in physical systems from atomic to planetary scales. Okay, so I'll just follow the narration that has been provided by the Nobel Committee. So basically, they have given this example as an example complex system where you have a box which has many disks, for example, and you are in this regime where it is a very dilute system. It's a box and you have these disks that are sitting inside it. And then you start compressing this box. So you end up with one realization at the end where you can't compress any further. And this is the structure that is formed. So then you repeat this exercise again, and you see that this structure is difficult to get again. You will get some other structure. Okay. And both these structures that you get in the end are not ordered structure. There is no particular regular spatial organization of the disks, but a very disordered structure. So that's what it says. Every time many identical disks are squeezed together, a new irregular pattern is formed. despite them being squeezed in exactly the same way. What governs the result? And it goes on to say, Giorgio Parisi discovered a hidden structure in such complex disordered systems, which these disks represent, and found a way to describe them mathematically. So the problem that is discussed here or illustrated here is the physics of packing. So basically, if you take many materials and put it in a box and then you compress it, so what you get here is a packing of this, the close packing of these objects. And these close packing structures that one gets can be of different different types because of this disordered nature of the system and so on. So we'll come back to this packing problem later. But we first focus on the particular place or the playground where we started exploring these ideas of disorder and so on. And this is the system called spin glasses. So spin glasses are essentially an alloy where you have iron atoms, which are indicated by this red color spots, in a sea of green color spots, which are copper atoms. So typically these are alloy. And since each iron atom behaves as a magnet, and so imagine that if you had if these green color spots were not there, then ideally all these iron atoms or this moments would be pointing in the same direction if you are in the low temperature phase and so on. But because this is in the sea of these green atoms, there is no regular organization of these moments that emerge. So this is this idea, this system of spin glass. So a spin glass, so basically this is again from the Nobel citation. So however, in a spin glass, they are frustrated and have difficulty choosing which direction to point at. So basically they cannot figure out which way to go. And using his studies of spin glass, Parisi developed a theory of disordered and random phenomena that covers many other complex systems. So we will focus on this physics of spin glasses. So you have this iron atoms that are sitting there and the magnetic moments that are correspond to these iron atoms in the sea of this copper atom. The interaction that is experienced by this iron atom between two such iron atoms is given in this shape. So this is called the RKKY exchange interaction. And it is typically a cosine function and so on, and amplitude depending upon distance and so on. And you can see that if it's a cosine function, sometimes it will be positive, sometimes it will be negative and so on. And this positive and negative and the distance, it gives this interplay and so on. The other important thing that one should realize is that this is, so these iron atoms are spatially located randomly in space. So this is, there is a randomness in their location. And also once this location of these atoms are made in a material, they are fixed for infinite time. So therefore, these are called quenched. So disorder, which is quenched infinitely in time, and therefore called quenched disorder. So quenched disorder and having interactions which have this plus and minus sign as a function of distance and so on. So what is the experimental observation of these materials? The experimental observation is that if you take such a material and then you cool this system as a function of temperature and so on, and you measure its susceptibility, which is some kind of a response of the system, one sees that the response, and so there's susceptibility increases as you lower temperature, and then there is a cusp, and then the susceptibility decreases. So this is a typical signature of a phase transition. And one would expect if, for example, it was a ferromagnetic system, that at temperatures lower than this transition temperature, all the spins or all these magnetic moments would be pointed in the same direction. However, in this case, because it's this quenched disordered system, it's not clear whether at all there is a phase transition. And if a phase transition is happening, what is the new phase that is emerging at low temperatures? And as a point of note is that the magnetization, the effective magnetization or the net spin is very small in this case. So there is no visible order as we know from classical ferromagnetism and so on. So there's a new phase that is emerging and one has to find what is the phase. So the problem that one faces in these systems is this idea of frustration. So this is illustrated in this schematic diagram. So for example, let's say you have this triangle and these triangles and the spins and the interaction between these locations is such that two such arrows would be pointing in opposite directions. You have to satisfy that constraint. So you can satisfy this constraint in this direction, along this arm, But in the third location, it's difficult to satisfy this constraint. It becomes difficult. You are not sure whether it's up or down. And this is this idea of frustration. So for example, in the square placket over here, and the constraints are indicated by this plus and minus signs, you are able to satisfy this constraint where you where according to the constraints that are put on the arms. But if you go to the other placket over here, then it is difficult to satisfy the constraints, and you have one spin or this moment which becomes frustrated. So this frustrated is a very symptomatic of all disordered systems, and not only on lattice systems, but also off lattice systems, the particle systems that we'll come to, and so on. So to describe this models or the systems, as a physicist, the simplest thing to like to do is to write down some model interaction. And this is what this simplest spin glass Hamiltonian looks like. So basically, the interaction is let's say you have two such magnetic moments or spins, sigma I and sigma j, and they're interacting via this coupling, which is jij. And these j's are quenched, that is, they don't change with time. And they are also random variables. And typically, there are two classes of models that one can think about. One is called for example, the Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model. And here the j's are random. And for example, having a distribution with a variance which goes as 1 by square root of n. So this is basically, it's sort of like an infinite range interaction. And in this limit, it's basically a mean field model and so on. The other class of models is this Edward Anderson model. And here the interactions are more short ranged. And so these belong to the class of the mean field models and so on. So, so for example, this Hamiltonian was first written down by Edwards and Anderson, and then Sherrington and Kirkpatrick looked at the long-range limit and so on. So what Parisi worked on mainly, or its main findings are in the context of this mean field model or the Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model. Okay, so for such models where you have this kind of a random coupling between the spins and you have this infinite range, so what you are essentially trying to do is to find out the thermodynamic properties of this system. And so you have to do the machinery of statistical physics, because we're interested in thermal properties of large number of spins, for example. But now you are confronted with this idea of quenched disorder. So the difficulty comes in computing the free energy, because in computing the free energy, you have to compute an average over the quenched disorder. Given by this this bar over this log of z. Jz is some size of the phase space, let's say. So doing this disorder average becomes a very difficult task mathematically. And then what one does is use something called a replica trick. So that is, use this mathematical identity that log z average can be written down as a limit n tending to 0, 1 by n log of z to the power n average. Okay, where n is some continuous variable, it's continuous thing. However, when you are actually doing the calculations, n does not become a continuous thing, but it's actually what the calculations does is use n as integers. And essentially, the program is to calculate with many copies of the system and then finally take the limit after doing all your algebra and so on. So now the question becomes is how to, suppose you were doing all these calculations and so on, then you want to figure out whether there is order in the system as you cross some temperature and so on. So what would be an order parameter? So what Parisi suggested, and this was after initial work by other researchers in this field, that the order parameter could be something like an overlap between two such replicas. So you have one copy of the system and another copy of the system. So you put one copy on top of another copy and see how much of overlap is there between this of the system. Okay. So then initially, so since you have n copies of the system, you can have a n cross n matrix. And so basically then the diagonal elements is basically a self overlap that you are taking an overlap with yourself. And you can put this to be zeros. I mean, you can take 1 minus q or something like that, and this can be zeros. And you can imagine that if, for example, you have n copies of the system, you can have a n cross n matrix. And so basically then the diagonal elements is a self overlap that you are taking an overlap with yourself. And you can put this to be zeros. I mean, you can take 1 minus q or something like that, and this can be zeros. And there is no, you can take the overlap with other states to be some number q. Okay, so this q could be 0 or finite. Okay, so so this is called the replica symmetric ansatz. So basically that there is some fixed overlap with all between any two copies of value q. So what these researchers found, initial researchers found that below a critical temperature, one can find solution of this Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model. But the problem, and one can find solutions such that at temperatures above the critical temperature, Q is 0, that there is no overlap between the copies. And below the critical temperature, there is a finite overlap between the copies. However, the problem was that so in principle, there is a transition, quote unquote, but the problem was that the solution eigenvalues that one obtained became negative and so on. So it was an unstable solution and people couldn't figure out what to do and so on. So that is where Parisi's contribution comes in. So he gave the idea that, he had this idea that one can find solutions where there is a symmetry break in the replicas. What do I mean by symmetry broken replicas? So basically what you can have, so you can imagine that your matrix now partitions into two parts. Basically one part where you have one overlap Q1 and another part where you have another overlap value Q0. Okay, so basically you are saying that suppose I have n copies. One fraction of those copies, I have an overlap Q1, when another fraction of those copies, I have an overlap Q0. So if I take this ansatz for the order parameter and feed it into my machinery, what was found is that indeed below a critical temperature, a solution is stable. That is, you go from a state 0 overlap to a state where you have finite overlap, except that now you have two kinds of overlap. Overlap having a value Q0 with some copies and another with another set of copies, and where Q1 is always larger than Q0. Okay, so this solution was found to be stable. So basically Parisi found a solution to the Spingrass problem, and eventually this was proven by exact calculations and so on. So in fact, what Parisi proposed was that there could be K replica symmetry breaking, in the sense that, so initially there is no, everything is replica symmetric, so there is no breaking of symmetry inside the system. But as you lower the temperature, suddenly this partitioning happens, that you have you have a certain overlap with one set of copies and another overlap with other copies. So this green block is where you have more overlap, and the blue block where you have less overlap. And then as you lower the temperature, it can happen that even within the green block, you can have further partitioning such that the red block has more overlap. Some copies have more overlap, which is the red. And then you have another set of overlap, which is the green. And then you have less overlap, which is the blue. So basically so the first partitioning is called one replica symmetry breaking. And the second partitioning is called two replica symmetry breaking, and so on. So this can happen. And this was the proposition of Parisi. As a function of the lowering of temperature, that you can start from a replica symmetric state, and then you can, as you decrease the temperature, you can go to a case where you have one replica symmetry breaking, and then you can, as you lower the temperature even further, you can have two replica symmetry breaking, and so on. So how do we, this is all mathematical, and how do we physically think of this? So this is the schematic to look at, for example. So here, let's say you have plotted the energy as a function of your coordinates in a high dimensional space. So initially you had only one minimum and in this landscape, and as you were lowering the temperature, then you have more and more minima appearing inside the landscape, and eventually at very low temperatures you have many such multiple local minima occurring, and so on. So you can imagine that, this partitioning of the landscape as you go to lower and lower temperatures can be thought of in this form of a tree diagram. So at high temperatures, you are in this node. And as you go to lower temperatures, you have two nodes appearing. So basically, any set of states which are over here will have one overlap value, let's say Q1. But with the other set of states, you will have another overlap, which is Q0 and so on. eventually, as you go to lower temperatures, there is further partitioning, and as this can go on infinitely. In fact, you can. There are some problems or systems where you can have fractal landscape. As you go lower and lower in energy scale, it becomes more and more partitioned, and so on. And this can go on infinitely. And then one also gets a measure or the count of the number of local minima that is emerging inside the system, and this is called complexity. Okay. So this was the idea, or this is the scenario that Parisi proposed and showed that there is a stable solution in the case of these spin systems which have this disordered coupling and so on. And but the question was that whether these solutions are still stable in systems which are not mean field or finite dimensional and so on. And it turns out these solutions are still stable, but one needs to run this finite dimensional spin glasses, and you can only do this numerically for very long time scales. And it's not clear whether these solutions will continue to be stable over very long time scales and so on. But over the timescales that people have simulated so far, these solutions still continue to be stable. And in fact, Parisi and co-workers have set up a special cluster called the Janus cluster. This is housed in which have been tuned towards doing this spin glass simulations. I mean, the architecture is, the hardware is tuned in such a way that you can do the spin glass simulations very effectively. So one thing that I should point out at this juncture is that, I mean, Giorgio Parisi's analytical contribution or the theoretical contributions is immense. And so is his also contribution in developing numerical algorithms or numerical ideas in investigating and probing different properties of these kind of disordered systems. So these contributions of Parisi came around the years 1979 to 1983 in a series of papers. And so this basically this idea of replica symmetry breaking and this partitioning of the landscape as you go on lowering the temperature is the ideas that come forward from this spin glass systems where you have quench disorder present. So now these ideas are carried forward to other systems where similar disordered systems, and then see that whether these ideas are applicable there or not. So one crossover or immediate crossover that you can do are in the system of structural glasses. So what are structural glasses? So structural glasses are glasses that we see, I mean, the window glass, the glass, I mean, in the car and so on and so forth. And these have fascinated faces for a very long time. So if you look very closely at these solids, these are solids, but if you look very closely, there is no ordered pattern of the atoms or crystalline pattern of the atoms and so on. Rather, they have very disordered structures. And the other fascinating thing is that as you decrease the temperature of these systems, the viscosity goes on increasing. I mean, at below some temperature, and there's a certain rapid rise in the viscosity, and at around the glass transition temperature, the systems becomes very, very highly viscous. So the important difference between spin glass systems and structural glasses is that in the structural glasses, there is no quenched disorder. That is, the coupling, I mean, the interactions are not, interaction between two particles is not the same, or its neighborhood is not exactly the same for time infinity. Because the particles are moving around, there are the kind of the local disorder or the interactions are spontaneously emerging and so on. And so what one says here is that the frustration that we talked about in the context of the spin glasses, where you cannot satisfy all the constraints across the bonds or in the plaquette and so on, this frustration is something that is not frustration which spontaneously emerges inside the system as the particles are moving around. Okay, and this emergence of frustration because of these interactions, many-body interactions and so on, lead to the formation of glasses. I mean, this is the perception. Okay. So this was the domain of thermal glasses, where you have this increase in viscosity and this formation of the disordered structures as you lower the temperature and so on. And then Liu and Nagel in late 1990s, they proposed a unified phase diagram, which is this phase diagram which combines the state where you have finite temperature and also athermal, or where temperature is not relevant, and so on. And where, for example, if you compress the system, and the example that we gave earlier on, where you do a packing of the of disks. So if you compress the system, you can land up into these jammed states and so on, where you cannot compress the states system any further and so on. So this is the regime shown over here. This is a schematic diagram, and typically you take granular systems and you compress and you get these jammed structures and so on. So then if you apply some load or force, these systems become unjammed and so on. And all these jammed structures that are forming over here, these are also very disordered and so on. And these jammed materials are materials that we're using in our everyday life. So in cosmetic, food, I mean, in the nature, snow, or in industrial applications and so on. So these materials are everywhere in a daily life, and intrinsically, all of them have very high viscosity. All of them have need to be unjammed by some load, and they exist in some very disordered state. So the similarity between these materials and the spin glass systems is that if you write down the energy of this system as a function of its coordinates, so suppose you have n particles and you have so you have this very high dimensional space spanned by this n coordinates, then the energy function is very rough in this coordinate space. So what we say that there is a very rough landscape. So which is schematically, for example, shown here, that maybe there is a crystalline state, but you also have this very rough landscape where the system can exist in disordered state and so on. And in the context of the thermal glass problem, so for example, when this system is sort of basically freezing in this highly viscous state to a solid glass and so on. So the question is whether there is an ideal glass state or not, whether there is a glass transition, phase transition happening or not. And this is $1 million question, and there are a lot of people are working in this field and so on. So the point, the similarity with the spin glass system, which is again another disordered system, is that basically rough landscape. And what is the picture that we have in mind is that as you are lowering the temperature of the system, this material can get trapped in any of this local minima. And because if you are at low temperatures, then there is not enough thermal energy available to you to escape from this local minima, or it may take very long time scales to escape from this local minima and then go to other minima and so on, and eventually find the ground state and so on. So that is why there are enormously long relaxation timescales or increasing viscosity inside the system and so on. So, so as a one-line summary, glassy dynamics emerge out of the system's excursions in this rugged landscape. And there are many theories to understand, or trying to understand, or theoretical propositions to understand this phenomena in structural glasses. And one such theory is the random first-order transition theory, which is inspired from the spin glass physics and so on, where you can have a mosaic of states which exist in different local minima simultaneously and so on. So, so the thermal problem is, I mean, very difficult to solve and so on. But imagine that you are a thermal problem. So in the athermal problem, what you're essentially trying to do is basically trying to find the local minima of this energy landscape. And this is, again, a very difficult exercise. And in fact, there is a very useful contribution, or an important contribution from Parisi and co-workers, who suggested an algorithm, which is called the SWAP algorithm, which allows one to access these low energy states, because otherwise numerically accessing these low energy states becomes a very difficult problem. And typically one always lands up, even during the minimization process, in these high energy states inside the landscape and so on. And the Parisi algorithm, the SWAP algorithm, actually allowed us in recent times to go to this very low energy states and so on. And so recently, some researchers in US, Dennis and Corwin, they showed that if I now zoom into this landscape, its energy landscape, which is this energy landscape formed by this packing structures that we talked about initially, this landscape also has this kind of hierarchical structure that Parisi proposed and demonstrated for the mean field spin glasses. So maybe it's also possible that in this sort of glassy systems, or this disordered but non-quenched disorder system, you have landscapes which also have this structure that is there in the spin glass system. So one can see this direct correlation between what the findings of Parisi in the spin glass physics and so on. And then again, continuing in this domain of physics. So this is some very recent work, and it's completely unrelated to glasses and so on, where in experiments, this replica symmetry breaking was observed in something what are called random lasers. So random lasers are different from standard lasers in the say way that the environment that amplifies and provides feedback to generate the laser signal and so on. These are some dispersed medium, a randomly dispersed medium, and not some ordered structure and so on. Okay. So what these researchers observed, or group of researchers observed, is that if you pump up this laser at different pumping strength, then you then the spectrum that you get at any instance can be very different from the spectrum that you get at another instance. So, for example, here is the picture that one has of the spectrum that one gets for one particular pumping strength, but you get very different realizations of the spectrum. Okay. And then they did a distribution of the spectrum, and you can see that if you have low pumping power, then the spectrum has a certain width dispersion. But if you go to larger pumping power, then you have much more broadness in the spectrum. And what they showed is that if you compute the variance of these distributions, then there is supposedly a first order transition as a function of the pumping strength and so on. And if I compute the distribution of the frequency present and so on, so then what they did was basically they then did an overlap function or between the different realizations of the spectra. And so, and what they showed is that if you are above a certain or below a certain pumping threshold, then you have this unimodal distribution. But if you go to higher pumping strength, then you have this bimodal kind of structure, which is very characteristic of the one replica symmetry broken state, that you have one cluster of states where you have a single overlap Q1 and another cluster of states where you have another overlap Q0. So this was a very interesting finding, and maybe this needs to be probed further. But where these ideas of replica symmetry breaking are actually realizable in experiments in a completely different context, but where disorder is also present. So then I make my foray out of physics, and then I basically try to illustrate that these ideas of replica symmetry breaking have been very successful in computer science, and perhaps my colleagues in computer science are working on this. The problem in physics was a problem of finding the low energy states or ground states and so on, which was a minimization problem or essentially an optimization problem. So one can do similar optimization problems in other contexts. And so, for example, there is this problem of random satisfiability and so on. So you have, let's say, n Boolean variables, and you're writing down some constraints or m constraints in terms of k of these Boolean variables and so on. So then you ask whether all the constraints can be satisfied and so on. Maybe I'm talking very glibly, but so the important quantity here is basically the ratio of the number of constraints that you have to the number of variables that you have, m by n, which is this quantity alpha. And so basically what, I mean, researchers already know that if your number of constraints are very large, then you will not be able to satisfy all the clauses and so on and so forth. And so basically, if you are above a threshold alpha c, then you will not be able to find solutions. And what Parisi and co-work, that if you use this replica symmetry kind of machinery, then you can actually show that there is a alpha d below above which you will start seeing the clustering of solutions. So below alpha d, lots of solutions are possible, but above alpha d, you start seeing that this clustering of solutions when some solutions become viable, and this clustering is very similar to the replica symmetry breaking that one sees in spin glasses and so on. So and then the y-axis is basically how many such constraints you allow to be violated and so on, and then one can draw a phase diagram and so on. So the lesson is basically that these ideas of replica symmetry breaking that they used in spin glasses can also be used in understanding computing problems in, for example, in optimization, and then also error correcting codes, image restoration, associative memory, machine learning. So you can see a plethora of problems in computing where this replica symmetric breaking ideas can be used and have been successfully also been realized or investigated and so on. So I'm just trying to summarize now. So of course, I talked only about the contribution of Giorgio Parisi in the context of understanding the physics of disordered systems. But Parisi's contribution to physics is enormous in the sense of he has worked in many different fields. His training, his PhD training was in high energy physics, and later on he forayed into statistical mechanics. And my colleagues have been discussing about high energy physics colleagues have been discussing about his contribution to high energy physics and so on, which is nicely summarized here in the citation of the Dirac medal that was given to him in year 1991. He said the study of scaling violations in, I mean, basically these are the different topics for which he's recognized. His study of scaling violations in deeply inelastic process, the Alterelli-Parisi equations, a model that links supersymmetry and superconductors together, the introduction of multifractal equations into turbulence studies, stochastic differential equations for growth models of random aggregation, Kardar-Parisi-Zhang model, his groundbreaking analysis of replica method that has permitted an important breakthrough in our understanding of glassy systems and has proven to be instrumental in the whole subject of disordered systems. So you can see that variety of fields or the breadth, or the enormous breadth of in physics that Parisi has contributed to, for which he has got many such recognitions, the important ones being the Boltzmann Medal in 1992, Dirac Medal in 1991, and more recently the Wolf Prize in 2021. And there are many other prizes and so on. And before I hand over to Shankar, I'll just also mention that Parisi has also contributed to the physics of climate change. And there is this nice paper that he wrote in 1983 on the theory of stochastic resonance in climate change, where they were trying to understand certain periodic recording of climatic changes that people had made and using our understanding there within the context of stochastic resonance and so on. So with that, I will end and I will hand over to my colleague Shankar to discuss about the other half of the prize. Thank you.
So before Shankar takes over, I wish to thank Pinaki for a wonderful talk. It was very exhaustive and very lots of resources. So I just remembered that Arijit said that I should say a few words about Parisi. Okay. So the last transparency of Pinaki explains Parisi very well in terms of his contribution. And I have had the pleasure of interacting with Parisi at ICTP over years. And in fact, once in a leisure school in 1982, we were together for 6 weeks and Parisi spoke about his replica symmetric solutions and so on. Parisi is also very special as a human being. He's a very friendly man, very carefree. He doesn't mince words, and he's very critical about government if they do something wrong. And he has lots of young colleagues. And as Pinaki said, analytical methods, or numerical methods, or computers, or computing. He is a real scientist. So, with that few words, I will.
I'll just say some light story. I mean, so so in 2006, I was in a leisure school where Parisi was also one of the speakers, as you mentioned and in 2006 was also the World Cup, soccer World Cup. And we were watching the Soccer World Cup together. I mean, there were a lot of people there and watching the Soccer World Cup together. And that year, Italy had won. Yeah. And the French colleagues were very sad. And there was this very unpleasant incident of where Zidane headbutted another player and so on. So a few days after that, we were having lunch together. And suddenly Parisi said, you know what, my daughter has got the football jersey of Materazzi. That was the player whom Zidane had headbutted, and he was overjoyed about it. And of course, the French colleagues were very unhappy and so.
Yeah, he was a very amazing guy. And also, I wish to point out that ICTP, the International Center for Theoretical Physics, started by Abdul Salam, which is headed by our friend from TAFR now, who is the director. It's an amazing place. It's a very eclectic place. It has played important role in nucleating new ideas among very different people from very different disciplines. Like this Kardar Parisi Zhang. Zhang was a student at CISA and ICTP, PhD student. I knew him at that time. Then he started interacting with, and he was working on string theory and so on, Black-White models. He started interacting with Parisi and then came the famous KPC. So he has influenced lots of young people. So with that few words, let me thank you, Pinaki, once again.
Thank you.
So now I hand over the mic to our colleague Shankar. Shankar, please.
Yeah. So let me share my.
Great.
It's
it's visible.
visible.
And you are audible. Yeah.
Okay, so let me thank Rahul and Arijit for organizing this talk and inviting me to. So this is going to be about the second half of the Nobel Prize, which is the physics of a particular complex system, that is the Earth system. So these are the two climate scientists who got it. Both of them born in 1931, so they are 90 years old now. Manabe started off as a meteorologist. Of course, after that, widened out and became did important work in general climate, this thing. And Hasselmann started off, I mean, these are the roots. He started off as an oceanographer. Now, let me first talk some zero level things about weather and climate. So we are talking about, when we talk about, we are talking about the atmosphere. So which is a very thin layer of air that covers the Earth. And the weather is defined as the state of the atmosphere. At any point of time, it characterized by whatever you see in the newspaper daily, temperature, relative humidity, and so on. It fluctuates by the minute, by the hour, by the day, and seasonally. So it's always constantly changing. Climate is defined as the weather averaged over decadal scales. So 10 years, 5 years, your choice depending on what you're doing, but long-term averages. So that all these variations don't matter. And so consequently, it's actually a more stable object because it's the average. And so, for example, climate prediction is an easier problem than weather prediction. Now, this is what determines the climate and the complex system that is the Earth. We divide it into components in our heads for convenience, but all these components are actually dynamically interacting with each other. Everything is, of course, powered by the sun. And each of them is a complex system in itself. And there are a lot of dynamical interactions between all these. And that is what finally determines the climate, the weather, and consequently the climate of the Earth. Now, one point to make is that the climate was never unchanging. The Earth was never in thermodynamic equilibrium, and it will never be. Issue is how fast. It's well known there have been glacial cycles, so cold periods, warm periods at time scales of tens of thousands of years. And what do you call it? Is the basic forcing is the sun, and basic reason for this variations is the small variations in the Earth's orbit due to the influence of other planets. But the response is quite nonlinear, and it's also not constant in time, since the Earth today is not what it was 1 million years ago in terms of land cover, various other aspects. So the whole issue now is that everything suggests that after the industrial evolution, the rate of change of climate has become about 10 times what it was earlier. And understanding this is where Manabe, Hasselmann, and various other people's contribution comes in. So you can see here, I've tabulated these. Typically, rates of warming or cooling were about few degrees per 1,000 years. or even less. Whereas now it has become 0.2. I mean, in the 19th century or 1800 to 1900, it was warming at the rate of 0.23 degrees per century. And in the in the 20th century, it went up by about 1 degree. So this is the reason for the concern, that it's changing at a much more rapid rate than it was in the past 10,000 years, 20,000 years, and so on. This is, how did we start understanding this? So will sort of lay it out in a historical fashion and try to point out, to place the work of Hasselmann and Manabe in that context. So actually the story starts with Fourier. So in 1894, he wrote this paper called General Remarks on the Temperature of Terrestrial Globe and Planetary Spaces. As you know, Fourier was one of the pioneers in understanding the theory of heat. And so automatically he worried about this question: what determines the Earth's temperature? We knew, and even he knew, that roughly on the average, it was about 15 degrees centigrade. Question was, why is it so? Why not 100? Why not minus 50? What sets this temperature scale? Now we know the answer now, and he also qualitatively knew it, that what sets is what is called the energy balance, meaning the Earth is getting heated up by the sun because of the incoming radiation coming from the sun. Then as the Earth warms up, it also radiates, because all hot bodies radiate. So at some point of time, the amount it radiates out is going to become equal to the amount of that it radiates in. And at that temperature, that's the temperature which will become stable. So any change either in the incoming energy or the outgoing energy can change the temperature of the Earth. Of course, Fourier did not have the laws of physics to do quantitative calculations, but he raised a very important question here: how does the atmosphere influence the temperature of the Earth? So he drew the analogy with the so-called hot boxes, basically prototypes of solar cookers. And let me not discuss it in detail. But finally, the fact that the atmosphere behaves like a hot box made him make a very inspired guess that, maybe the atmosphere behaves like glass. It lets in light, but blocks the outgoing radiated heat, and hence it warms up the Earth. So the Earth would have been much colder if the atmosphere had not been there. And that is what nowadays we call the greenhouse effect. Next, the question was, what is it that makes the atmosphere behave like glass? So there was a series of experiments done by a condensed matter experimentalist called Tyndall. And this is his original paper written in 1861. And you can see he was motivated by Fourier and other people's work. So he discovered that the main greenhouse, basically identified the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that make it behave like glass. So aqueous vapor, that is water vapor, and carbonic acid, the old-fashioned name for carbon dioxide, and hydrocarbons. So these are the primary greenhouse gases which were identified by Tyndall. So after that, in 1960, Maxwell's equation came. It was understood that the radiations are all electromagnetic waves. The laws of radiation, Wien's law, Stefan Boltzmann law, all these got discovered. And immediately after that, Arrhenius, used these laws to estimate, to quantify the greenhouse effect. That is how, this is the paper, on the influence of carbonic acid in the air upon the temperature of the ground. Now, he and Fourier and others were actually not motivated and pumping in CO2 into the atmosphere, but they knew about the existence of ice ages from geomorphological evidence. So they knew that the climate had changed drastically in the past, and that was what motivated them to do this work. So this table is just to show, it's a tedious calculations, all these things for this thing. It's quite a brilliant paper with fantastic data analysis in it. Ultimately, he concluded that if the carbon dioxide concentration doubles, then the temperature will increase by 5 to 6 degrees. And also the temperature is strongly controlled by the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, mainly carbon dioxide. Now this holds true for today, that if the logarithmic dependence that is implied over here, except that it nowadays the amount that the temperature will increase is more believed to be somewhere between 2.5 and 4. Arrhenius had overestimated it. Of course, the data then was not so great. So the end of the beginning of the 20th century, it was known that the temperature of the Earth is concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there was some rough estimation, quantitative estimation of how much it will increase depending on the increase of concentration. The first person to my knowledge who talked about human activities is a British engineer called Callender. So he estimated that man has added huge amounts of CO2 into the air, and then from the work of what do you call it, Arrhenius, he estimated that this should result in a detectable warming rate of warming of the temperature. And he looked at whatever data that there was that he had access to, and concluded that indeed it is warming. Of course, the data is not so great. There would have been a lot of uncertainties. So this was not conclusive, but it was very indicative. And this was 1937. Next question was, is the carbon dioxide in the air actually increasing? You see, because of course, human activities are pushing in CO2 into the air, but it may be getting absorbed in the ocean. It may be getting other places. Actually, is the atmosphere, is the concentration increasing? A very definitive answer came from this classic paper by Keeling, who made, this is the graph in his paper. We're representing 10 years of work. So in this lab in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, he did 10 years of very careful measurements of carbon dioxide. And there's a clear, so this is 1958 to 1968. And there's a clear increase, systematic trend increase in the CO2 levels. So that established it. Now this lab, and of course many other labs also, have continued to do this monitoring. And this is called the Keeling curve. And you can see right from 60 onwards, it has just constantly gone up. Right now it is around 420 parts per million. And pre-industrial age was always, it has never increased beyond 300 parts per million. So that's the, then came the climate models, because also computers came around in after the Second World War, they developed. And that I think writing down and analyzing all these models. There are models at all levels, simple models like what they call energy balance models, which are what we would call zero-dimensional models, just looking at gross averages and resulting in, mathematically ordinary differential equations with finite number of variables. Then came more complicated models called global climate models or global circulation models. These are attempts to numerically simulate the entire atmosphere. And of course, they need high computing power to do anything. But it also requires a deep understanding of the atmospheric processes to build such model, because it's not just a question of setting up a scheme to solve the Navier-Stokes equation all over the globe. There are many, many processes going on. When does it start raining, cloud physics, how water vapor is transported through the atmosphere, etc., etc. And so you need to understand that to build, to write a good model. And that's where Manabe's contribution comes in. He was one of the first, what do you call it? I mean, there were many people developing models that time, not Manabe alone. He was one of them, and his contribution is considered very valuable. So these are basically papers where various processes of the atmosphere he's discussing. And these are all in the 60s, 61, 64. This gave a one-dimensional model, and this is a classic paper of the one-dimensional model of the atmosphere, which radiative convective model, as they say. And finally, this was a GCM, which is a full three-dimensional climate model. Now, there was one, survey conducted by some organization, this is the URL, where they asked all the IPCC report, the authors of the IPCC report, what they thought were the three most influential papers in this field. And the clear leader was this Manabe and Weatherland 1967. This is the one that I boxed. It's considered to be a real classic in the field. The way they analyze the processes of how water vapor and heat gets transported in the atmosphere. So after that, in the 70s, there were independent models of the atmosphere and the oceans. So the ocean affecting the atmospheric model only as boundary conditions and vice versa. But after that, they started getting integrated, and they're called AOGCMs, Atmosphere Ocean General Circulation Models, which coupled the dynamics of the, dynamically coupled the atmosphere and the oceans. And that development went on for a few decades. Finally, from 2000 onwards, there's so-called Earth system models, which also incorporated carbon cycle, basically the influence of the biosphere and the land system, coupling of that to the atmosphere, and so on. So today, the models, in a rough way, simulate this entire Earth system and study. There are so many processes going on which are input into these models that they're quite complex. And, so then they'll continue to get developed for a very long time. Now, because of that, and also, how do you infer anything from the model? In the sense that these are complicated programs, complicated codes. You give some input, you get some output about the weather conditions. What is causing what? And everything is very noisy. There are measurement errors, as well as you say, the weather is very rapidly varying. So it's intrinsically a noisy system. And so, how do you infer, consequences of, say, putting in more CO2 into the atmosphere? How does it change the signal? How does that signal come in the data? So the statistical theory of such inferences is where Hasselmann's contribution comes in. Incidentally, before the Nobel Prize, I was not aware of his work, but now I'm finding it very interesting and important. So his first work was to understand the noise in climate. So this is, you can see, this is the global average temperature. A lot of fluctuations are there. Though there's a trend which overall goes up, it keeps fluctuating. And if you look at a small region of the Earth, the fluctuation. So these two papers, he tried to understand this noise in the climate data. Then after that, concentrated on how to, the signal to noise problem in atmospheric response studies. And finally, he developed this how to best apply the standard signal to noise problem based on standard probability theory to the problem of atmospheric physics and climate physics. And finally, this paper, we'll see the impact of this one. So the interesting thing about his work in fluctuations of climate was that, as we said before, the climate is defined as average weather. So the fluctuations in the climate is determined by the fluctuations of the weather. And his result was that if weather has white noise, is characterized by white noise, then climate is characterized by red noise. In the sense, it is very similar to the Brownian motion. So if weather are like the atoms hitting the pollen grains, then the average behavior of the pollen grains is something like the average behavior of the climate. So now once he is, and by the way, and this was consistent with data, you could compare the climate variables, the fluctuations data, and it was considered. So red noise is 1 by f square. So having understood the noise, he went on to the signal to noise ratio and said, this optimal, so you have to filter the data, you have to sort of smoothen it out before getting anything reasonable out of it. And I'm not going to go into the details because I don't understand them, the detailed maths of his procedures. But we can just look at the impact. It was his motivation was clear over here. A clear identification of the anthropogenic signal in climate observations would reduce the present scientific uncertainties, etc., etc. So what was can one attribute it to human activities is the main thing. And this is also part of the introduction of that paper. So the second part was his first two papers, determination of the relevant statistical properties of natural climate variability. Third part is this paper. This paper addresses the optimal detection method. As I said, this is an excerpt from this Nobel Prize website. It says that this paper started off was initiated large number of work for what is now called detection and attribution studies, and says it provided strong scientific support for the conclusion reached by IPCC in 2013. 2013 is a typo, as we'll just see. It's 2007. It should have been which gave a clear attribution of the current rapid climate change to human activities. So to see that, let me just go through these IPCC reports. So just for in case someone doesn't know, IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN organization set up initially by the World Meteorological Organization in 1988. So because the aim was to warn society about the danger of this rapid climate change. So they don't do any research. What they do is analyze all the published work and put it together in the form of basically review articles, which they call the assessment reports. And one part of the assessment report is what they call summary for policymakers, where they sort of summarize the main conclusions of the detailed report. So the first assessment report was 1990, and they are not very sure that they're not even sure about whether the increase that they were seeing at that time up to 1990 was just natural or whether it was enhanced greenhouse effect, etc. Then 5 years later was the second report. Here also you can see they are not very clear. How, I mean, there seems to be some indication that um, I mean, global warming is happening and extreme weather is happening. However, there is not been possible to firmly establish any clean connection between human activities and these climate changes. Third assessment report was 2001. Little more confidence over here, but still not very clear cut, with some changes attributable to human activities. Fourth assessment report 2007, there's a sudden drastic change in tone. Now here saying very high confidence that global net average of human activities since 1750 has been on warming, with qualitative estimates of how much warming it has caused. And even this very high confidence is very defined, that very high confidence means 90% confidence limits. So this is clearly, the statement is based on some sound probability theory, meaning some sound statistical analysis of data and sound system of inference. And so this is part of the effect of Hasselmann's work. And you can see his paper was in 1993. So about 15 years it has taken for the idea, for people to get used to, accept the idea, use it in various ways, and put it to practical effect. That's around the time any new idea takes to have an effect in science in any way. After that, there's been no doubt. Rest, I mean, the AR5 came out in 2013, and the sixth report came out just this year. They discuss other details, but attribution to human effects is beyond doubt here. So let me finally finish with some, what do you call it, the situation now. So now it is well known, established that the climate is controlled by the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, something that was known long ago, but become much more certain now. So it will stabilize only if the greenhouse gas concentration stabilizes, which means that you should emit only that much CO2 into the atmosphere that the Earth can absorb. Or so that is called the net zero condition. Now, as has been quite pointed out in media, various things, that main issue is not when net zero is this thing, but what is the concentration in the atmosphere at the time that net zero is achieved. Now, here's the data of the Keeling curve. For the 1.5, 2 degrees before, with respect to pre-industrial era temperatures, the Keeling curve should flatten at this review. That is, the concentration of CO2 should not go beyond this range. But you can see there is no sign of flattening at the moment. It seems to be going up. The question is that after some time, will it go down like this? So this is the opening remarks by Patricia Espinosa, who's in this Glasgow conference, which was held just now. Being held, actually, it's continuing. Started on October 31st, and it's going on. So they agree that emissions continue to rise, that this NDC's nationally determined contributions, which various nations promised in the Paris Agreement, that despite all that, it is still rising. But they are saying, okay, maybe it's going to start leveling by 2030. So we have to keep an eye on that Keeling curve. Maybe it will start leveling off, who knows. But that is what matters. So all the talk and all the is made by various governments, ultimate pudding is that Keeling curve. I mean, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere has to stabilize. So I think I'll thank you for your attention. I'll stop over here.
Thank you, Shankar, for a wonderful talk. So we had two wonderful talks, and we have ample time for discussion. Already in the chat box, there are two questions to Pinaki. The first question is by Umar Shankar Jaina, who is asking about quantum fluctuations, because Pinaki said that in a spin glassy state, the spins are frozen in some random directions. So he's asking, what about quantum fluctuations? Pinaki.
I am not, maybe you are the better person to answer this question.
So it's a very important question. Depending on the magnitude of the spin, if the spins are low, like half, the quantum fluctuations could become very important at low temperature. And in fact, the whole spin glass may disappear into some kind of glassy liquid. In fact, this issue of quantum fluctuations in a spin glass was started by a model in the context of spin liquid by a model by Sachdev and Ye. It's a Sachdev and Ye spin glass model, which is like a generalization of Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model to quantum spin glasses. That model has gotten sharpened into a very popular model called Sachdev, Ye, and
SYK.
Kitaev model, SYK model, which is very popular because it addresses some issues of black hole thermalization, entanglement, and so on. So it's a very important question, and it is relevant for real spin glasses for low spins, and I believe there are some experimental work and theoretical work in this direction. Yeah.
So has this Parisi ansatz be tried on the SYK model? This was one question that came up recently.
Right. So apparently, in the SYK model, there is no replica symmetry taking because there is too much quantum fluctuations, and there are other structures though.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the answer I have got, because people have worked hard to see possibility of replica symmetry breaking. This is my understanding. I'm an outsider. But
okay.
And the second question is by our colleague, Sitabra. He's invoking the very popular simulated annealing, how it will work against the swap method that Parisi and collaborators have suggested recently.
Actually, the swap is not recent, even it's also quite old, but it's just so happened that some people, took up the swap method and went ahead with it, and it turned out to be successful. It seems it's more efficient in lowering the energy than the simulated annealing. It's not clear why, except that you are basically jumping around in phase space more efficiently than the simulated annealing, it seems. But what I would say is this, that let's say if we look at work in the last 5, 6, 7 years, where SWAP has become really popular in reaching the low energy states. So it was just one method that somebody took up and followed up and was able to reach, or a set of people to reach these low energy states. But it only is successful for one class of models. It's not, for those who don't know SWAP, so for example, if you have a mixture of two sizes, what you can do is that you can take one size particle and try to swap it with another size particle. So basically, you are then moving around in configuration space. And with the Boltzmann weight, sometimes it's successful, sometimes not successful, and so on and so forth. And as you can, size ratio is too large, then of course this is not successful. So this is only successful, or this only works for a very small class of problems. But fortunately for this group of researchers, and remarkably, this has worked very well, and they have been able to reach low energy states. But what has happened is, this has really given a spur to now trying to figure out what are the different algorithms that one can try out in reaching low energy states. And maybe simulated annealing will work in some context. We don't know. So basically, what has happened in the last 5, 6 years is that people now looking at different kinds of algorithms which will somehow shake up or move you away from your location in phase space to another part of the phase space. And SWAP is one such method. I mean, this also from, I mean, one knows that in cluster algorithms have existed since time infinite. I mean, time infinite as in people, I mean, people have used cluster algorithms. And this is one kind of that you are jumping around in phase space, and it has worked. And it has been successful. So now a lot of people are working, looking at wide class of algorithms to find low energy states, and maybe simulated annealing will work in some models. We don't know. I mean, that was my answer. Chitabra, does that satisfy your question?
Sitabra, yeah, okay. So now, in fact, people, you can raise your hands in the Zoom, and then I will unmute for you, and you can ask the question. So before people start asking questions with Shankar, I have one question to Shankar. Shankar, you pointed about the noise analysis by the second Nobel laureate, Hasselmann.
Yes.
So, like, in the case of Brownian motion, Einstein was able to measure the weight of an atom and also count the number of atoms, like Avogadro number. That was considered as a great success.
Yes.
So, is there anything analogous in this context by a noise analysis? What can one infer that you may miss otherwise?
Yeah, interesting question. And answers, I don't know.
Okay.
One should look at it in more detail. Yeah, I don't know. So, is there some information about the climate contained in the noise? Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, let me read the, so lots of questions. So one general question to Shankar, what do you think about India's commitments? About India's commitments?
In COPs, so I don't know, because track of these numbers. All I would ask is there a plan?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when they say that they're going to reduce by 2050, they're going to reduce the fossil fuel consumption by half. And then by 2070, going to reach net zero. You can say these things, but what is the plan? What is the consequence? I really don't know. I have not kept track of.
So, this is Murthy's question.
Yes.
I mean, India's commitments to COP26. And there is a remark from, let's see, was there a remark from Rahul Siddharthan? Rahul Siddharthan, yes. Probably one can do that. I think that we need.
Yeah, that was for me. I have replied. I mean, we can discuss separately.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I'm mixing up.
It's okay, no problem.
That's too complex. Okay.
Yeah, maybe one can ask the audience.
Yeah.
If they have any.
Exactly. Yeah.
India's
an audience, the floor is open to you. If you have any questions, please raise your hands, and we'll unmute you, and you can ask questions.
Yeah. Now about this India's commitment to COPs.
Yeah, for example.
COPs, India's commitment.
But Shankar, the whole thing is very scary, in the sense of the future.
Yes.
But will all the revolutions that is going on in technology, science and technology, will it in 20 years from now will make the world a better place and for all lives?
I don't know. But I think, without reducing consumption, there's only so much you can do with technology and so on. And I don't see people doing that. So the whole idea seems to be that either wait for some, dramatically more efficient source of solar or some such thing, or do geoengineering. I mean, pump in CO2 into the atmosphere, take it out by artificial means.
Okay, I see.
Shankar,
RR has a question.
I saw a little fluctuations, some zigzags in the Keeling curve. Is it any particular periodicity involved?
Yes, it's an
That's
annual
annual.
annual seasonal variation. It's basically a
Just
winter.
annual season.
Yes.
Okay, then nothing more.
Yeah.
Is there a 11-year cycle of the
No.
variety that one finds in the solar spots?
No. This variation is because is of the fact that there is
Summer
more
dependent.
land on the northern hemisphere than the southern
Okay,
hemisphere.
by Earth's rotation.
Not Earth's rotation. There is more plants and more photosynthesis going on in the northern hemisphere.
Okay.
So in the northern hemisphere winter, there is overall less photosynthesis going on and less carbon dioxide being absorbed from the atmosphere. Whereas in the northern hemisphere summer, there is more photosynthesis and more being absorbed.
That's what I meant, the Earth's rotation, the Earth's revolution. Okay, understand. Yeah.
Shankar, before the audience come up, I have a question about the last ice age. How long back it was, and what was the level of change in mean temperature and so on?
So last, what they call last glacial maximum, that is the peak of the last ice age, was around 14,000 years ago.
14,000.
14, 15. I mean, in different places of the world, it will be different. This typical swings in temperature during these glacial cycles is about 10 degrees centigrade.
10 degrees?
Yes. From, I mean, if you look at the warmest time to the coldest time, that difference is around 10 degrees centigrade.
10 degrees. So the ocean level will change enormously.
Actually, the probably the ocean level was about 120 meters below the current sea level during the last glacial maximum.
Oh, just 20,000 years ago.
Yes.
I see. So what about natural catastrophe? Like meteorite. Like we say, the dinosaurs disappeared because of the huge meteorite collision and corresponding ash and so on.
The volcanic eruptions, when the big enough ones, do produce changes in temperature. They produce dips in the, but they're not long lasting.
They're not long lasting.
The whatever aerosols get deposited by the volcanic ash, it'll settle down in a few years, and so on. It has a short-term effect, surely, of cooling, because
there's a user who is raising.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. Two participants raised hands. Please, let's see. Who are they?
RAN. You may go ahead and ask the question.
Please, yeah.
Hello. I hope I'm audible. I have a kind of general question.
Please announce your name.
Sorry, my name is Ranjit. Okay. So the general question is, we generally talk about sun is the only source of energy virtually for us, but I can think of one more source, which is nuclear. When we consider nuclear energy, when we mine it nuclear ore and use it for whatever purpose. I'm curious, how would it add to the global warming, the presence of nuclear element and the resulting contribution to background radiation in the atmosphere? I'm sure it must have gone up in last 100 years. We have been running various nuclear plants, etc. So in this sense, is nuclear energy really a green energy, and what is its contribution to global warming? Can it be a footprint? And that's my question. Thank you.
Shankar, please.
Well, it won't contribute much to global warming in the sense it doesn't put any greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. So in that sense, it's, I mean, yeah, it won't contribute to global warming. I don't know if it contributes significantly to the background atmospheric radiation. The nuclear weapons tests which were done in the atmosphere contributed a huge amount. Reactors, I don't know. I think the main problem in reactors is the waste disposition, final disposition of nuclear waste.
There was the next question. Somebody raised a hand. Please unmute yourself and ask the question. Harijit, you said there is two hands.
Professor Ramachandran wanted to ask another time, I think, question. Professor Ramachandran, could you kindly unmute and ask your question?
Well, I don't have anything serious to ask, but I was wondering whether this ice ages that you talked about, what is it due to? Maybe nothing to do
So
with this.
it is actually the primary cause is the so-called Milankovitch cycles. That is the changes in Earth's orbit because of influence of other planets. The ellipticity changes slightly, which is by 100,000 year period. Then the axis of the orientation of the axis of the Earth changes in two directions with periods of 26,000 years and 40,000 years. Now, it's in this context that actually Parisi's work on stochastic resonance came. The thing is that if you calculate the change in solar insolation, that is the amount of solar energy coming into the Earth, that is minimum because of this change of ellipticity. So the strength of the 100,000 year signal is the weakest, whereas the response of the Earth to that signal is strongest. I mean, if you take the Fourier transform of the temperature record of ages, the largest amplitude is 100,000 years. So Parisi's idea of stochastic resonance was trying to explain this.
Okay.
And I don't know, I think it's not fully accepted by the community yet, but I think he sticks by it because he mentioned it in one of these interviews that I heard just after the Nobel Prize.
Is there a prediction for the next ice age, when it will be? Or is it another random phenomena?
So we are at an interglacial warm period. I mean, between ice ages. So I don't know whether, see, none of these models will work for more than a century or so. So, but then there may be the simpler models which work, which will give you prediction. So I don't know the answer, but ice ages periods are tens of thousands of years. So next stage, and we are at an interglacial. So if you naively look at the graph and extrapolate, it will come in another 10,000 years.
Shankar, I remember you were very excited about a talk that you heard from a speaker from Princeton about this issue.
Yes.
So please advertise that.
Yes. So he was asking this question.
South African physicist.
Will human activities affect the next ice age?
Yeah.
And he was also I mean, making the point that it is not Milankovitch cycle alone. I mean, related to this answer that it's a very nonlinear response, to the forcing, that the 100,000 year signal is much stronger than the other. So I think he had some other way of looking at it, that there's some natural processes in the Earth itself, which also
Contribute.
contribute. Whereas I think Parisi's, I'm not familiar with that work, but yeah, I don't know.
Maybe you should send a reference to Ara in the email, because he may be excited by some of these. Yeah. Okay, so Arijit, so we have like 7 minutes after the fixed
There is,
time.
Professor Bhaskaran, there is one question in the chat box by Nilanjan Sasmal. How far is the fusion reactors usable?
Yeah. How the question is, how far is a fusion reactors usable? Or I think what's happening to the program?
As of now, it doesn't exist.
So far they have not hit the break-even point, as far as I know.
But it's remarkable, they have been struggling hard for the last more than 50 years.
Yes.
And there is an international cooperation and so on.
Yeah, so I think I don't know much about it, but this laser fusion seems to be
laser-assisted fusion. Yeah, it's a big field. Lots of activities made. So the question is, how clean is fusion?
No, I mean, from the greenhouse gas point of view, fusion are both clean.
But even from waste point of view, nuclear waste.
That maybe somebody else in the audience can take the question. If Murthy is there.
Fusion would definitely be cleaner in terms of waste. Because you don't have any radioactive waste from fusion.
That's what I heard. Yeah. So I will hand over to Arijit. Thank you, Arijit.
Thank you, Professor Bhaskaran. I would like to end by thanking both Pinaki, Shankar, and Professor Bhaskaran in time and doing this for us. Thank you all for joining. For those of you who are interested in IMSC Popular Lecture Series as part of ACCM, there will be a lecture by our colleague Shitabro Sinha on November 26th. So it would be also streamed live on YouTube, but it will be a physical lecture most likely. So those who are joining from outside the institute, they should be able to watch it on the Math Science channel on that day. So with that, I will thank all of you. Thank you all for joining. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.